Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. Today's episode is a conversation I had with Deborah Bronk, the president and CEO of Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences. To say that I enjoyed talking with Deb is one of the biggest understatements I've made in a long time. Deb's work in science, if you want to see her cheer, mention nitrogen, and then science administration is fascinating. Her most recent accolade is being elected a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in December 2020. In short, Deb is all that. Before we get to our conversation, I wanted to let you know that the MSF has a new store. We've got it stocked with t-shirts, onesies, and mugs, and designs are inspired by the science that happens in Maine. All proceeds keep MSF events free and accessible to all. I've put a link to the store in the show notes. Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. You are at Bigelow Laboratory, so I thought maybe you could just give us a quick overview of what you do at Bigelow in the broad scheme. We're not going to talk about science yet, and then tell us how you got to Maine.
Okay, so I am the president and CEO of the laboratory, and my main job is to really facilitate the science that's here. So Bigelow is unique. I've spent my entire career at universities, which are very hierarchical and can have a lot of bureaucracy. Bigelow has a pretty flat governance structure, and the scientists here all have a say in how the lab is run. So I am less the president that you would think of in a corporation that might, make proclamations and then everybody follows them. That is not Bigelow. So I work with the scientists to figure out what they need and then to try to help them get it, or to make sure that the facilities and instruments that they need to do their work is available. I am charged with recruiting new scientists. So we just hired 5 new scientists, and I'm hoping to recruit 1 more in a couple of weeks. So that is a really important part of my job. And I also do fundraising, which was the part of my job that I was most worried about. Like, am I going to like to do this? And it turns out it's probably my favorite part of the job, because what I do is I have to learn what everybody in the lab is doing, right? So it's going back to grad school. I'm reading papers on all these different topics. And that's a myth. People think you have a PhD and suddenly you know everything, and you don't. And we are as confused by our colleagues when they give their talks, if they use jargon, as anyone else, right? So it's all about learning what people are doing, then finding ways to engage people in the government, in industry, philanthropists, to teach them about what we're doing, why it's important, and then hopefully get them to support us, whether it's giving of their time, making sure legislation that is necessary to support our science, or to give their financial resources to us so we can do our work. So that's a really fun part of my job, which is not necessarily what I expected. Turns out very wealthy people that care enough to talk to the president of a lab are pretty cool people, right? They're people that care, and they're smart enough to realize that science is important. So it's fun.
So all of that, honestly, I could just spend my time talking to you about your job there, but I do want to talk a little bit about the science, because what you're doing now is not what most people think of as when they think of a scientist. I will get back to that, because I think what you're doing is actually critical. But you said your background was at universities, and I know that you were what I would call a hardcore bench lab scientist. Maybe you could tell us, before we started talking, you said you didn't know any scientists growing up. How did you get into the world of science when you didn't have examples to follow?
So I give my mother the credit. So I'm a first generation college student. Neither of my parents went to college. My dad actually went for like 2 weeks, and then he got a contract to play minor league ball and was like, I'm out of here. So he played for the Dodgers, their farm team. They were both there. Unfortunately, I've lost both of them. They were voracious readers, and my mother loved science, and she loved museums and libraries. And so I was one of 3. I was a middle child, and we were marched around to museums and science. I had a little laboratory in my basement under the steps, and I watched The Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau, which was on Sunday nights. So I grew up in Tennessee, and I'm originally from Wisconsin. So both are a long way from the ocean. But I grew up, ever since I was a tiny kid. I was about 6 when I decided I wanted to be Jacques Cousteau, which ironically, he's not really a scientist. He's an explorer and an inventor. I would pretend to be remember that, I'm not sure how old you are, but there used to be a show called Emergency, and they had the briefcases that they would run out with all their equipment. Well, so my dad gave me one, because my dad was a businessman. He gave me one of his old briefcases, and I set up with like a health kit for the ocean. Only I pretended when we spent time on a little lake up in far northern Wisconsin. And I would pretend that there would be an ocean emergency, and I would take my briefcase and run out to the boat and measure all this. I don't know. I puttered with water. So that's where that started, really, from a TV show. And then the encouragement of my mom. But I give my parents huge credit. I mean, to have your daughter growing up in Nashville, Tennessee, say, I'm going to be an oceanographer. And they were like, cool, let's figure out how to make that happen. And we're supportive the entire time.
That's really extraordinary, actually, because it's not like you had the ocean right there to make it obvious, right?
No.
I mean,
I collect shells, and I used to collect them at garage sales. That sounds pitiful to me now.
Well, you are on the coast now, but
we'd be driving down the street. I was like, Mom, I think I see shells. And so we'd stop at these garage sales. And I still have my sewing boxes with the cotton in the trays with all my shells in them that I take out when I talk to school kids. So so that's how I got started. And when I went to college, I think because so I went to school at University of Miami, which at the time was the only school I applied to, because it was the only school that had an undergraduate degree in marine science. Now, you had to double major, so I was also a double major in biology. I remember that was a big deal. My father was not crazy about his daughter going off to Miami, especially at the time, because I remember the week I went to look at schools, my mom and I were driving down there. Paradise Lost, which was this Time magazine cover about the cocaine wars in Miami, came out. My dad was like, no. And my mom was like, get in the car, Debbie, we're going. So anyways, a huge support from them. And I wish, as a college professor, I would see kids that were so passionate about marine science. And yet, mom or dad wanted them to be pre-med or business or, something else. And it was just heartbreaking that they weren't encouraged to follow what they wanted to do. But anyway, so in college, I was a good student. I was a very good student in high school. I was Spence McGavick, which was kind of our valedictorian. College was a wake-up call. It was hard, and it was a 5-year program that I had to do in 4, because that's what Dorothy and Frank Bronk were going to pay for. So it was a lot. It was tough. If graduate school was as hard as undergrad, I don't think I would have gone.
So wait, how did you know that graduate school wouldn't be as hard?
Because I knew that you mostly did research. So I knew a few graduate students, and they were doing research. They weren't just taking classes. And I think what made college so hard was the standardized tests. Oh my God. A, B, C, D, A and B, and sometimes C, all of the above, none of the above. I actually saw that the more I studied, it was almost an inverse correlation with how well I would do on an exam. Because the more you study, the more you can second guess on, well, wait a minute, that might be an exception. Anyways.
So you were lucky enough to see that there were examples after college for grad school that it wouldn't be that awful, I guess.
That it wouldn't be that awful. Yes.
Yeah. So
I had a great mentor as an undergraduate, Kathleen Sullivan, and she would go to meetings. As scientists in each discipline, there are a couple of big national or international meetings a year where you go and present your work. And she was always looking for, I think, people early in their career that she thought were going to make a big splash and that seemed like they would be good mentors. And so she's the one that kind of guided me towards a few people, including Pat Glibbert, who was the woman who I did my PhD with, who worked on nutrients. I did not develop a love of nitrogen until I got to grad school. Pat was at Woods Hole Oceanographic at the time Institute, which is the largest marine institute in the world, I think still. And growing up, I knew of Scripps Institute and I knew of Woods Hole. And those were really the only two that I had ever heard of. And so that was my dream. So I get accepted by Pat. She's at Woods Hole. Everything's going swimmingly. And then I get a letter from her, which seems amazing to get any kind of information like this from a letter, but you used to. And she said, by the way, I'm moving to Maryland. And I was like, what? You can't do this to me. It was probably the best thing that ever happened to me because I ended up doing my research at the University of Maryland at a small lab on the eastern shore of Maryland, Horn Point Laboratory, and which was kind of a little nitrogen nirvana at the time. There were lots of people working on it. Pat has been a leader in that field for many, many years. And it was just the most supportive, wonderful place to do research. And the thing that I loved about graduate school is I don't think I ever really learned to think until I got to grad school, which is why as a professor, I've been so passionate about, it's not about a test, like talk to me, think about what you're doing. So I kind of was well known for giving off the wall tests. You could not possibly memorize and do well on one of my tests. Because it's the thinking that's the fun part. And we, in so many respects with these multiple choice tests, we counter the thinking skills that we should be putting in. And so I loved it. In my whole dissertation project, I did a lot of methods development, blew things up, literally blew things up. But my whole dissertation was kind of founded on the first semester of college chemistry, general chemistry, that I hated. There again, let's get kids in a lab and thinking about things instead of it's all being theoretical and with multiple choice tests. So anyways, I started working on nitrogen. I think because I didn't know any scientists really, I thought to be a successful scientist, to do research, you had to be a genius. And, I'm smarter than the average bear, but I don't think I'm a genius. And so my goal was to get my PhD and get a job at a consulting company to do work about nutrients. Because by this point I was very enamored of nitrogen, and which is an important pollutant in many areas. Move back to Miami and get married to my boyfriend, Ralph. So, and it was about my third year in grad school when many of my committee members they won't listen to this, but I remember sitting in a committee meeting, and by this point, at this point in your graduate school career, you have been embedded in what you're doing. And what I think grad students don't know is by that point, you know what you're doing more than anybody on your research committee, right? Because and they're doing 9 million things and you are just so focused. But I remember I had this kind of epiphany in this committee meeting being like, I could do what they do. Why can't I be a researcher? And it is also a point when you are a professor that you see the look in your student's eye because I remember sitting down and having meetings with Pat, and I maybe hadn't had a meeting with her for a month. And I would sit there and I would be kind of incredulous and so disappointed because I'd be like, it's like she doesn't remember what we talked about last time, not realizing that since last time she's had 700 meetings and done 1,000 different things. And all I've done is follow up on what I was thinking of a month ago. And I would say that to my students. I was like, oh, you're so disappointed with me right now, aren't you? It's like, well, let me tell you what's going on. Anyway, so I loved it. I just loved what I was doing. And once things started working, I think what's fun about methods development is you're doing something that nobody's done before. So there's no right or wrong answer. Something either works, or in my case, it blew up. So you kind of follow that path and it's really exciting. It's just.
So what do you mean by methods development?
Okay, so what I was trying to do is, if you look out in the ocean, there's all these different types of nitrogen. And most of the history of research in nitrogen in the ocean has focused on really 3 kinds. And everything else is lumped into this big group called organic nitrogen. And there was really, the tools to study that were not there. And I had when I started off, I had 2 advisors. Pat was one, and she was a nitrogen person. And Hugh Ducklow was another, and he was a dissolved organic carbon person. So this is telling. So I'm a middle child. So middle children tend to be the peacekeeper. So what did I end up working on? Dissolved organic nitrogen. It turns out that it had been kind of a hot topic, 20, 30 years before, and then it kind of fell out of favor, and they said, it's not important in the ocean. And it's not important in the ocean because it didn't seem to change. The concentrations were always pretty much the same, and there was no tools to study it. And so what I did is I used it's called resins, and they're basically little beads, and they were developed for blood work. So if you think about what our blood is full of salts, right? And so if you wanted to study, say, the proteins in your blood, you got to get rid of all those salts. Well, it was the same thing in the ocean. So there's all these salts that interfere with everything. And if I wanted to study the organic, like the proteins in seawater, I needed to get rid of all these salts. So I adapted the use of these columns to remove all the salts and to remove these other forms of nitrogen that everybody else was working on. So I could just focus on this organic chunk of nitrogen. And it turns out that it's not that it just hangs out and doesn't do anything. Organisms are taking it up constantly, but they're also producing it. So this is a really active pool of nitrogen that we were just missing completely because of how we were thinking about it. So what was fun about it is, in the beginning, I would have my ideas seem kind of off the wall, and I'd get in these arguments with some of my committee members. But in the end, most of what I thought was right. And so it wasn't just trying to figure something new out. It was like, gosh darn it, Hugh Ducklow. Yes, this can be true. And so it was just I had a blast in grad school.
It sounds almost like you figured out there was a nitrogen cycle going on that people didn't know about.
Yeah, it was kind of, behind the scenes. And it turns out it's important in a lot of ways. So DON has been very, very good to me. That's dissolved organic nitrogen, because there are all these different avenues that you could take it. So I've done research in the really fundamental, how does this operate out in the ocean, in Antarctica, in the Arctic, and the waters off of Fiji and Monterey Bay and Chesapeake Bay. Nitrogen is important everywhere. And it also has a lot of applied applications, right? If you want to figure out how to solve a harmful algal bloom problem, control how much nitrogen is going in a water body. I've worked in wastewater treatment plants, which I have 3 stepkids. My middle stepkid, Zane, got his degree in biochemistry, and he worked in my lab for a number of summers. And the first summer we were working in a wastewater treatment plant. He was like, you always seem like you kind of had an exotic job, and it's 1 a.m. and we're in a wastewater treatment plant. So the rose-colored glasses came off, but the next summer I got him out to the Arctic for 5 weeks on a research cruise. So I redeemed myself.
Better to end with that one instead of lead.
Better to end with that one. So anyway, so I really, really loved the research, and never, ever had any aspirations to do anything but that. But a couple of experiences led me down to where I am now. One was I was elected president of the Association for the Sciences of Limnology and Oceanography. So limnology is the study of inland waters and lakes. So it's basically freshwater oceanography. And these science societies are where scientists in any given discipline get together for these big national meetings to discuss their work, to give a talk on data that they can't figure out, to see if anyone else can figure it out, to see your friends, to see what they're up to plan cruises, research cruises. So I'm a huge advocate for science societies, and especially for women in a field like ocean science. When I started, it was still very much male dominated. And so, there were women that were in departments where they were the only woman, right? So where do you have your community? You have your community in your science societies.
Yeah, so I was struck when you said both your first mentors were women. That's super unusual, right? For our age, it's really interesting. it's an aspect of science that we don't talk about much, but the fact that you had two women that helped you get where you're going is pretty extraordinary, I think.
Yeah. Well, so the nitrogen mafia is a lot of women, right? So, and I think it's because one, kind of the grandfathers of the field, Dick Dugdale, Dick Epley, Jim McCarthy, these were all guys that were wonderful human beings and very supportive of their women graduate students. And then those women like Bess Ward, who I did my postdoc with, who's now chair of geosciences at Princeton University, and Pat, I think they did not have an easy time, right? Because they didn't have an easy time, I think they protected me in many respects and were very supportive. And they have both gone on to have a number of female graduate students. And so there's a lot of women in nitrogen, probably because, some of these big guns in nitrogen in the field were women who brought more women into the field. So, we do let men work on nitrogen, but we keep them under our thumb. And
when you said nitrogen mafia, I was thinking you all need a shirt. You need some code words.
We have nitrogen babe shirts. And if you would walk into my lab years ago at Virginia Institute of Marine Science, where I spent many years, I'd say, what do we think about carbon? And they would all go, carbon sucks. Yeah, so carbon doesn't. Well, actually,
no,
carbon
I know. It's
does
fine.
suck, right? It's like it's ruining our climate right now. Yeah. So we need it, but it's not as cool as nitrogen.
Sorry, I totally distracted you. So the science societies, which is interesting because I think it is a really valuable. They're not junkets, They're not go off and meet your buddies once a year at a conference and play on the golf course. They're really serious places where you catch up with people, and it's my husband is a physicist, so he's got different societies, and it's interesting because in the time of the pandemic, they haven't been able to do this, right? We haven't all been able to get together, but it's especially hard. As great as Zoom is, it's especially hard to feel like you're fostering and getting a chance to only dive into your science for that week or that 3 days. It's a time of getting together that I think you don't realize how important it is until you don't have it.
And it's for me, the science. So you could go and there are 4,000 people attending, an ocean science meeting. And many of those people are giving talks. So for me, I'm very judicious about what talks I try to go to because I just get saturated and then I don't hear anything. So there are some people I will always want to go see their talks, but most of it is every break, right? So, there's a morning break, an afternoon break, there's lunch, there's dinner, and I will have meetings every one of those. So when I would tell my graduate students this is not a sprint, this is a marathon. So you need to stay hydrated, especially since people usually drink alcohol in the evening. Stay hydrated, get as much sleep as you can, and be very purposeful about how to do things. And I could talk about science meetings a lot because what we have learned through the pandemic is how we can be more effective virtually, which is important, right? And I think most science societies will continue to have some virtual aspect of every meeting. It's great from the standpoint of, for example, young parents, right? On the other hand, what we're also seeing in this pandemic is the value of, in the case of a young parent, getting away for a week and immersing themselves in their science again, away from all of their other responsibilities to just recharge and get psyched again.
So how do you go from the society to Bigelow?
As I was elected president of the Science Society, I got to start going to the Council of Scientific Society Presidents meetings, which are held in Washington, D.C., and they're small, right? They're, maybe at most 150 people, usually around between 50 and 100. They're small meetings. And I think one of the things that it taught me the most is that I got very used to walking into a sea of white men in suits and feeling comfortable, right? There's not a lot of women presidents of science societies. Now that's changing, but it was such a great supportive group that I got very comfortable being in groups of people like that. And it also, because we would bring in Nobel laureates and CEOs and senators, and we were talking about science and how it's done kind of in a very broad sense, politically, economically, on a national and international level, I felt like it blew my blinders off of what was possible and how to think about things. And I'm still very engaged in that group. So kind of as a result of, and it was a pretty impactful presidency because we realized that we needed to kind of change our business model for ASLO, largely because of the stuff I was learning at CSSP, me and the president that followed after me, John Downing. So ASLO went through kind of a real transformation during that time. And as a result of that, the National Science Foundation, my name came up and was nominated to serve at the National Science Foundation, which is the federal agency that's charged with basic research in science, all science and engineering disciplines. And it's in the news right now a lot because Biden and Senator Schumer really would like to dramatically expand it, which I think is a great idea. I was in the Division of Ocean Science, and in that division, or in NSF overall, about half of the staff, and that's just rough, were people like me. I mean, I was a professor, I had a lab, I was an active researcher, and I took a leave of absence and went and served. And there I was director for the Division of Ocean Science. I had a $356 million budget, which I know, look at your eyes. That's what I did. You know, it was like, this is more money than God has, until I started looking at what we had to do with it. And when you think about it, that's about $1 a person in this country, right? For a country this size, it's woefully underfunded. So I got really, really interested in kind of what's the next generation of marine lab, because we can't afford to do what we need to do, especially with climate change and trying to get all the information we need to not only understand it, but then to develop the solutions. Anyways, but that's where I got the administration bug, because, you know, after spending my whole career trying to usually talk people into doing what I thought needed to be done, it was like, hey, we can just do it because I'm in charge right now. And it was great. And the group of people there were awesome. Like, we reorganized the division. And so that was a really great thing, a really great experience. And I'm happy to say I left NSF with it on the same pedestal that it was when I got there. It's just an amazing and inspiring organization. So that is what led me to Bigelow, because I went back to my research and I was, you know, got more projects going and all of that was great. And then I thought, wow, I'm right back to where I was. And I did become department chair, and realized trying to fight with the bureaucracy to get anything done was going to be, I was frustrated, and I missed being in a position to do things. So my friend Patty Matrai, who I had been on the ASLO board with, invited me to Bigelow to give a presentation on my Arctic work. And also she told me after the fact to plant the seed. I did not know that the executive director at the time, Graham Shemield, who was responsible for building the building behind me that you're looking at, was terminally ill. And so I went up, gave my talk, and just fell in love with Bigelow, because it looked like the kind of institute we were brainstorming, oftentimes over wine, when you never really know if those ideas are going to hold up long term. It turns out a lot of them did. And so when they called me, it was probably a year later, to say, your name has come up as a candidate. Would you be interested? And I can see it like yesterday. I was standing at the window with the phone to my ear for the longest time. And she said, Dr. Bronk, are you still there? I said, yeah, I am. Okay. Yes, I think I would. And I had taken on a new graduate student not that long before then, a couple of years before then, never thinking I'd be leaving. That's what got me to Bigelow, because I never set out to do this, and kind of thought it would be an incredibly boring thing to be an administrator, but I love it.
So Bigelow Laboratory is, unfortunately, as far as I'm concerned, under the radar for most people in Maine, not in the world of ocean sciences and not in the world of marine science, but certainly in Maine. And actually,
yes, I would agree.
And I think I actually think all of our research institutions are, right? If you talk to a person on the street and you mention Jackson Laboratory, they say, oh yeah, they do mice. I'm like, oh, they don't do mice. Like, yes, they do mice, but that's not what they do. I'm going to give you the floor right now. And I know this is not entirely fair, but if you could perhaps in like 5 minutes, tell us why you and I know that Bigelow is amazing and kind of the whole rest of the marine sciences world. What is it that makes Bigelow so extraordinary?
So I think it's how it started. So Bigelow was started by Charlie and Clarice Yench, who were both just real visionaries. Clarice, when I was at ASLO president, we started a new award, and I was like, gosh darn it, it's going to be named after a woman. And it was named after Clarice Yench, the Yench Schindler Award. So these were people that kind of in a nutshell, we're tired of other people telling them how to do science. So they came up here. Spencer Apollonia, who was the director of the Department of Marine Resources at the time, gave them a lab to use, and Bigelow grew organically out of that. And it was a place where people could really follow their passion, right? And you weren't really accountable to anybody because they weren't paying you. It was all grant driven. And it just grew. So, when Charlie wrote a grant, colleagues would come and visit, they would want to stay. And so this whole ethos of science, of a science place run by scientists for scientists, really captured the attention. And I think why it has continued to thrive is we're very focused, okay? We're not that big. So I think the reason why we've been able to have the impact in the field we've had is because we don't try to be everything, right? So we are focused on the base of the ocean food web. So we're looking at phytoplankton, bacteria, viruses, and then other foundational species. So things like kelp or corals that are the foundation of the environments where they are. And then one level up. So the things that eat those things. And that's pretty much, we don't do physical oceanography. We are focused on that. And we bring together a lot of different kinds of people, right? So we've got a mathematician sitting next to somebody that studies disease, sitting next to somebody that's interested in kelp, right? So not everybody is trained as a classical oceanographer. And that is really important because if you want to solve a problem, you need to get as many different kinds of minds on that problem. That's why diversity of all types is so important. So we really have the diversity of lots of different types of scientists. Then the other thing is one way to think about Bigelow is it's a lot of different businesses within one business. Each scientist is running their own small business, right? We give them, now it's about 10 weeks of salary a year. Everything else is contracts and grants. They can't ride on their laurels. They can't, just coast. They got to be bringing it every day. And so the whole environment is a very dynamic, exciting, and each other's success is somewhat dependent on success, right? Everybody's paying towards the bottom line. So it's also the least competitive place I've ever been in, which is just really lovely. We're all about let's get it done. We have a very lean staff. So all the, not all the money, but boy, the pandemic has really shown me how lean we are. We are lean. So we are very what's going to get the science done? That's where we're putting our investments, and everybody's kind of pulling in one direction. And now what I think is also really exciting is we will always be fundamentally going after how things work, right? As a basic research organization. But it's clear that we're out of time with climate change, right? The first peer-reviewed publication devoted to climate change was started in 1977. So scientists have been banging this gong for years.
I'll throw you another bit of information from my work on the warming sea. The very first research paper showing that the Industrial Revolution caused climate change was 1938.
Yeah, and Arrhenius gave a talk in, 18 late 1800s.
Like projecting, right?
That said, we're if we start burning fossil fuels, carbon into the atmosphere, we're going to warm up the planet. So we finally, I feel like we finally are getting some traction and we've got people's attention, but we're out of time, right? So what we need solutions now, and to get them to scale, right? So you're going to have a global impact, means you got to get things into the market. We can know how to fix things in our little labs, and until we get it out at market scale, we're not going to have the impact. And so that's another jump that Bigelow has done, and I think has done really well, because I realize now as a scientist, I would have kind of commercial ideas and just how naive I was on what it would take to make that happen. And yet we are making it happen now. So and thankfully, God, we've got some wonderful philanthropists that are paying for the kind of things that you need to get something to market, like FDA consultants, IP protection lawyers, all the kind of people that if you're gonna, in this case, we're going after methane production through cows. If you're gonna try to tackle that, you can't just have, some little experiment in your lab. You need to, in our case, we need to get a feed supplement into millions of cows around the world. And I think we're on track to do that, which is really exciting. So,
that's really cool. I've been following that whole storyline. Well, Nicole, I met years ago.
Yeah, no. So she's amazing. Steve Archer, Dave Emerson, two of the scientists involved, Kevin Posman. I mean, and a call out to Andrew Davis, who is the investor that's been supporting all this, and what an incredible partner. One of the things about science is that Bigelow talks to other science disciplines, and now I'm really seeing us reaching out to people in other fields, like investors that can look at our science experiments and ask really good questions that would never occur to us, because that's, again, you need different minds looking at the same thing. It's a really exciting time, and I think a very hopeful time in what is a really depressing situation in terms of our response to climate change.
I'm glad you said that. I think that's actually a really good segue into how you spoke with Lucas Richmond for his piece. I don't know if you remember all of that. It was almost 2 years ago now. You were the very first scientist he spoke with. You laid the groundwork for him for the next, I kid you not, 6 months of how he approached, how do I ask these questions of scientists? And you were so open and so willing to guide him through it. My take on it was it gave him this comfort level to really drill down with other people what their work was. It was a great start.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah, it was fascinating to watch him evolve, but also to see his comfort level increase. And I think you really set the tone. And so this is a very late thank you for that. You
are very welcome. I do remember that conversation. I don't remember all the details, but I do remember talking to him. Yeah, people, I think this is some of the perception of scientists, is that I see people hesitant to come and talk to scientists like we're some kind of mutant freaks. And boy, you ask a scientist to talk about science and you can't shut them up. Like that, we're thrilled to do that. And especially, I know one of the things about when I took this job and really made the decision to start talking more openly about climate change, my time in DC, we were advised, avoid the term climate change at all costs, because it was just toxic. And another thing, I'm going to call out Barbara Burgess, who is one of our board members. And I guess it was my third day on the job. She hosted a dinner at their home in Boston. They now live in Portland. Her and Bill Burgess is also on the board. He's our board chair. And midway, towards the end of the night, she asked everybody around the table, which were a lot of board members and staff members, to go around the table and say, why are you involved in Bigelow? And what was great about it is it was like really emotional as people were telling their stories. And I think what that allowed me to do as a woman scientist, I had been advising young women, nobody wants to hear you love the ocean. Tell them you know how to run a mass spec, right? Tell them what your skill set are. Tell them, right? Because you are being judged against guys that's what they're talking about, not the first time you saw a dolphin. And so I felt like, in a way, I had been pushing down my love and passion for the ocean so that I didn't come across as a lightweight researcher. And what Barbara really showed me is that in this job, part of what I've got to try to get out to people is you got to love this thing because it's dying. And we have the power to change that. And if we don't, humanity it's a bad scene moving forward if we don't really turn things around. And we're out of time, right? So this is not something, this was, I don't know if you've ever read the Uninhabitable Earth. One of the things that stuck out is that 85% of the warming that has been going on has been since Seinfeld premiered, right? So climate change, it's been changing ever since the first oil was burned, right? Since the first human, made a fire with wood, we've been adding things to the atmosphere, but the scale of what's happening is it's going off the charts. It's speeding up, and we have got to get a grip on this and get really aggressive now.
The one thing I've taken away from the last year with the pandemic is that when given the opportunity and the resources and the go ahead, science can respond, right? This response that we've had to the pandemic, and I don't mean just the vaccines, which on their own are an extraordinary story. I mean the testing. I mean, we did these forums, and Chinbro and Puritan Medical came on and talked about they built a facility in 2 months. It's crazy what they did, right? So what I get out of it for the climate change is we can do this. And it's time to say that we're going to do it. So I appreciate you saying we're out of time. What are we going to do? Because it feels like,
yeah. This is the United States of America, right?
We're
the
built
country
for
that put a man on the moon. This is our moonshot. This is
exactly.
our time. And what is thrilling is I think right now we are talking in DC about the scale of investment it will take. And it's an investment that will pay us back in spades. Science investment pays us back in terms of the economy. You think I'm looking at my iPhone, I saw this great presentation. It was actually the iPad where they looked at all of the NSF grants that went into that iPad. And the titles of these grants were hysterical, right? The snooze, you could fall asleep reading the title. They sounded so boring because they were in physics, they were in material science, they were in social science. They were these nerdy things, but that's the foundation you have to build so that somebody like, a company like Apple has all of the pieces to put together something that changes the world.
So one last question for you. What has it been like being in a much colder part of the country with a much colder ocean than what you were used to for the rest of your professional life?
So first of all, I think I do have the genetic, well, I'm going to make a joke, even though anyone geneticist is going to be like, that's not how it works. I'm like genetically programmed to like love cold weather. So my Wisconsin blood is coming out. I love Maine. I've lived in Santa Cruz, California, and I've lived in Miami. And the one thing I can't handle not having seasons. I love me some seasons, and Maine has the most beautiful, I think, seasonal progression of any place I've ever lived. So that part's been fine. And I love snow. I love me some snow. The colder ocean, since I'm a nutrient person, I was a scuba diver, but here's what happens when you grow up in Tennessee and you, what's in the library are shark attack books. I don't like swimming in the ocean. Give me a lake. I'm a lake girl. And so the temperature of the water is not an issue for me because I don't go in the water very often. I love to kayak. I like to windsurf. But my goal is to not touch the water.
Deb, this has just been a delight. I so appreciate your time, but more than that, I appreciate your enthusiasm for science and for the ocean in particular. I love talking to you about this, and I look forward to finally having the world premiere of The Warming Sea next March. And I am over the moon about all of that. So
excellent. Well, thank you for all the work you do. I mean, gosh, we need an army of you.
I don't know if there's a lot of people that would agree with you on me personally with that, but I'll take it.
Okay.
Thanks a million.
Wonderful talking to you. Thanks so much. And bravo for all the work you're doing.
Thanks. And to you too. As you heard at the end of our conversation, Deb and I spoke quite a bit about climate change. Deb was one of the people that composer Lucas Richmond spoke with when he was doing his field research for his MSF commissioned piece, The Warming Sea. The world premiere of The Warming Sea will be the 2022 headliner event for the Maine Science Festival. We've recently partnered with Seabags on a fundraising collaboration where the proceeds will help support that world premiere event, as well as the Climate Change Institute at the University of Maine. I've included a link in the show notes. The Maine Science Podcast has received support from the Maine Technology Institute and is recorded at Discovery Studios at the Maine Discovery Museum in Bangor, Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is produced and edited by me, Kate Dickerson. I receive production support from Miranda Bouchard and social media support from Next Media. The Discover Maine theme is composed and performed by Nick Parker.